Imagine discovering that the name you carry, the one etched on your passport, whispered in classrooms, or printed on billion-dollar companies, is tied not to honor but to mass murder. For the heirs of the Third Reich, this is no abstract nightmare. They are the daughters of Joseph Goebbels, the grandchildren of SS officers, the beneficiaries of fortunes built on stolen property and slave labor. Their inheritance is not merely financial but moral, an invisible tattoo of history that marks them wherever they go. Some live in denial, erasing the past from family conversations. Others wrestle publicly with guilt, desperate to distance themselves from crimes they never committed yet can never escape. Their existence poses unsettling questions. Can innocence survive proximity to evil? And what happens when the wealth and power of a regime built on death still pulse through the veins of its descendants? The Third Reich was not only a dictatorship of ideology, but also an empire of privilege. Adolf Hitler relied on a network of loyal elites, ministers, generals, industrialists, who profited immensely from war and persecution. Families like the Quandts, later owners of BMW, amassed fortunes by exploiting forced laborers. Others, such as the Goebbels family, gained proximity to power and influence that carried on in hidden forms after 1945. When the Nazi regime collapsed, its leaders were disgraced or executed, but the structures of wealth and privilege they built did not vanish. Many perpetrators' estates, businesses, and reputations were quietly absorbed into post-war society. Descendants inherited not only money and influence, but also the shadow of complicity. Unlike the nation that could collectively claim "never again," these families bore a more intimate question. What does it mean to carry a legacy rooted in one of history's darkest regimes? The heirs of the Third Reich are not confined to history books. They walk among us, often unnoticed. Some carry infamous names, like the daughters of Joseph Goebbels, who lived in obscurity despite being tied to Hitler's propaganda minister. Others are heirs to dynasties that still dominate modern industries. The Quandt family, whose wealth ballooned under Nazi exploitation, remains one of Germany's richest clans, tightly linked to BMW. Then there are the children and grandchildren of high-ranking SS officers and party officials, many of whom live in silence, fearing exposure or shame. A few have chosen a different path, breaking family codes of secrecy to confront the crimes of their ancestors. Each of these heirs faces a dilemma: to bury the past and protect the family name, or to bring hidden truths to light, risking alienation in the pursuit of honesty and moral responsibility. The legacies of the Third Reich are written not only in blood, but also in balance sheets. During the war, German industries thrived on stolen property, confiscated businesses, and the exploitation of slave labor. When the Reich fell, many of these fortunes remained intact. The Quandt family, whose factories used tens of thousands of forced laborers, later transformed into industrial titans, with BMW as their crown jewel. The heirs enjoy billionaire status today, yet for decades their role in Nazi crimes remained hidden. This pattern repeats across families. Silence became a shield. Descendants often avoided discussing the past, encouraged by post-war German society's desire to move on. Inherited mansions, artworks, and company shares passed quietly to the next generation, while public scrutiny was rare. Wealth allowed these heirs to maintain status and influence, but it also deepened their moral dilemma. Should they acknowledge how their privilege was built, or continue the silence that protected their families for so long? For some, this silence was suffocating. For others, it was the only way to survive the burden of a name forever stained by history. For the heirs of the Third Reich, the true weight of inheritance is not measured in money. Many grew up in households where silence was law, where questions about fathers, uncles, or grandfathers were deflected or met with anger. This created a fractured identity. On one hand, they were ordinary children. On the other, they carried an unspoken stigma tied to the crimes of their bloodline. The psychological impact is profound. Some descendants describe living with an inherited shame, feeling as though guilt seeps through generations, even though they themselves committed no crimes. Others wrestle with conflicting emotions, pride and family loyalty versus horror at the deeds that secured their privilege. A few turn to activism, writing, or public testimony to confront this past, but such choices often meant breaking from their families entirely. The ethical dilemma is equally stark. Should heirs renounce their fortunes, expose family secrets, or attempt to use their privilege for restitution? Or do they have the right to live unburdened by crimes they never chose? Their lives force a haunting question. Can innocence truly exist when one's identity is entwined with inherited evil? In the decades following 1945, German and Austrian societies often preferred silence over confrontation. The first post-war generations were eager to rebuild, and the crimes of the Third Reich were spoken of cautiously, if at all. This collective avoidance extended to the families of perpetrators. Neighbors, colleagues, and even friends often chose not to ask uncomfortable questions. In this atmosphere, many heirs found it possible to live quietly, their surnames disguised by marriage or their wealth concealed behind corporate structures. But as the decades passed, silence became harder to maintain. The rise of Holocaust scholarship, survivor testimonies, and investigative journalism exposed family histories that had been kept hidden. Documentaries such as The Silence of the Quandts forced heirs of industrial dynasties to confront their complicity. Public attitudes shifted. Where once heirs might have been shielded, they were now challenged to account for their legacies. Today, the reckoning continues. German society demands transparency and remembrance, not concealment. For the heirs, this often means facing scrutiny not only from historians and journalists, but from their own children and grandchildren, generations unwilling to inherit silence as their only legacy. The legacy of the Third Reich is not confined to those who lived through it, it ripples through generations. Studies show that children and grandchildren of Nazi perpetrators often inherit not only silence, but also subtle attitudes shaped by family memory. In some cases, this manifests as lingering prejudice or nationalistic pride passed down through unexamined stories of duty and sacrifice. In others, it emerges as deep empathy for victims and a commitment to preventing history from repeating itself. Psychologists describe this as a form of transgenerational trauma, where unspoken guilt and shame are absorbed by younger relatives. Families that never addressed their complicity created an atmosphere where the truth hung in the air but was never acknowledged, producing confusion, denial, or rebellion. At the same time, sociologists have found that regions with strong Nazi influence during the war still exhibit higher levels of xenophobia today, a chilling reminder of how ideology seeps through time. For heirs, inheritance is rarely just financial. It is a moral and psychological transmission, shaping identity, choices, and worldviews long after the original perpetrators are gone. Their lives embody how history lingers, not as distant memory, but as a presence woven into family and society. The lives of Nazi heirs vary widely, but a few stand out as emblematic of the burden they carry. Perhaps the most infamous lineage belongs to Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister. Of his 6 children, only one survived the war. Helga, Harald Quandt's half-sister, perished in Hitler's bunker. Harald, however, inherited not only his mother Magda Goebbels' name, but also vast wealth from his father Günther Quandt, an industrialist who exploited slave labor. His descendants became billionaires, their fortune entwined with BMW. For decades, the family avoided public scrutiny until a 2007 documentary, The Silence of the Quandts, forced acknowledgement of their Nazi ties. Other heirs chose anonymity. Goebbels' surviving daughters lived quietly, avoiding public attention, their wealth and notoriety hidden behind new names. For them, silence was survival. By contrast, figures like Austrian writer Martin Pollack chose confrontation. Pollack's father was an SS officer involved in mass killings. Rather than bury the truth, Pollack exposed it in his writing, examining how family memory and complicity shaped him. His decision to speak broke generational silence, but it came at the cost of ruptured family bonds. These contrasting paths, wealth and concealment, silence and anonymity, or exposure and reckoning, illustrate the spectrum of choices facing the heirs of the Third Reich. Each decision reflects a different way of grappling with a past that refuses to fade. The stories of the Third Reich's heirs extend beyond Germany, touching on universal questions of inherited responsibility. Their struggles mirror those faced by descendants of colonial rulers, slave traders, or apartheid leaders, families whose privileges were built on exploitation and violence. In each case, wealth and status are passed down while the human cost is buried, forcing later generations to confront a troubling paradox: how to enjoy the fruits of prosperity without ignoring the suffering that made it possible. These legacies also challenge societies at large. Nations prefer collective narratives of heroism or victimhood, often leaving little space for descendants of perpetrators. Yet, the heirs of the Third Reich remind us that history is not neatly divided between guilty and innocent. Their existence underscores that privilege can endure long after regimes collapse, and that reckoning with injustice is a task that stretches across centuries, not just lifetimes. The heirs of the Third Reich live in a liminal space between past and present, bearing names, fortunes, and legacies they never chose. Some inherit silence, others inherit shame, and a few inherit the courage to confront what their families try to forget. Their lives remind us that history does not simply end with the fall of regimes. It seeps forward, shaping identities, choices, and societies long after the guns have gone quiet. Germany's reckoning with its past is often cited as a model of remembrance, but even here, the stories of the perpetrators' descendants reveal gaps, tensions, and unresolved wounds. These heirs are not responsible for their ancestors' crimes, yet their existence forces us to consider how much responsibility comes with inheritance and how silence can perpetuate injustice. If history continues to live within bloodlines, then how many generations must pass before its shadows finally fade?